to appreciate how dire our situation is. President Shagari budgeted averagely 25 billion annually for 4 years. His 4 years he spent, the federal budget was $100 billion. Our current budget, and at that time, the population of the Federal Republic was 73 million. Today, and this is 39 years after, today our budget is 23 billion, 8.6 trillion divided by 360, you can do the arithmetic yourself, is 23 billion. So the population is more than doubled, but the revenue, regardless of the value of the currency, has dwindled. That, more than anything else, explains why we have all the flares throughout the country, whether it's in the northeast or in the north central or in the Niger Delta. The flares everywhere because there's just not enough for all of us, and we're expanding. Now, if you extrapolate from where we are today with all these flares, all the challenges, let me remind us, the Gulf of Guinea has more piracy today than the Somalian coast. Let me also remind us that 4 countries, the United States, France, Britain, and Germany, maintain 10,000 troops in the Sahel to keep the fallouts from Nigeria. So we're now becoming, I don't want to call it a global nuisance, but I don't know what other term to explain this. But we're certainly a problem to our neighbors. The wife of the Cameroonian prime minister was abducted by Boko Haram, which is indirectly a fallout from Nigeria. So these challenges, now in another 30 years, and 30 years is a blink. 30 years will come and pass. I mean, I was governor over 11 years ago, so 30 years is nothing. In another 30 years, we'll be the 3rd most populous nation on the face of the earth, at 400 million people, to be India, China, then Nigeria. If we do not change the trajectory of Nigeria today, you can imagine what we will be in another 30 years. If we think what is happening is a problem, in comparison it will be child's play. Now, let me take a state like Lagos. I know Lagos is celebrated for its revenues and its strides. But when you go underneath the layer, what do you find? Lagos claims to be 24 million people. I said claim because that's what they state they are. And I think whatever, regardless of where you are on the divide on the number of people in Lagos, it's a heavily populated and densely populated state. It has a landmass of 3,000 square kilometers, which is really landmass of one of my local governments in Cross River State. Lagos has about 15% of Nigeria's population, occupying 1/308th the landmass of Nigeria. It's not too hard to see that something urgently has to be done. Now, I have great regard, and like as the Vice President said, there's a continuity in governance in Lagos, which has helped them a lot, and which unfortunately is not what we find in most other states in the country. But you see, the problem that Lagos as a state faces is way beyond the governance issue. If you have 750,000 people pouring into your state every year, and you have a landmass of only 3,000, and already you're vastly overpopulated, then you have a challenge. And the challenge is this: you'll have governors who would leave sufficient landmarks here and there and will be remembered for it. But do they have the resources to impact on the living standards, the quality of living of the people that they govern? This is a challenge that a state like Lagos has. And yes, we may celebrate it, but we have to go deeper. Now, there isn't too much Lagos can do in terms of agriculture. It's really to increase the productivity of the people. So it needs a lot more infrastructure and all that. But it kicked in It's cased in by its landmass. I once advocated that this revenue, this derivation formula as stated in the Constitution, should extend to all revenues, not just natural resources, but to all revenues, because there is a wear and tear on the infrastructure to generate the revenue. So let me take a state like Lagos. To generate, and Lagos probably accounts for almost half of Nigeria's non-oil revenue receipts. To generate all those receipts, there is a heavy wear and tear on Lagos infrastructure. I think states also need to derive something from that. And this just not only applies to Lagos. I mean, if you're going to sustain it, then you've got to support it so that it's sustainable. Take a state like Gombe. They have the Ashaka cement factory. Something goes to the federal government for that investment. Something should also return to the state, because the state, one way or the other, will be involved in providing infrastructure, even if it's for the evacuation of cement. This makes states have a stake, and not just a stake in developing their economies even more than is being done today. Now, Lagos has a budget of 1.2 trillion. It sounds great, but in real terms, it's just about 50,000 naira per head, which is $16 million per head. It amounts to nothing. Now, each state in Nigeria, in my mind, can and ought to be financially viable. It's not just being a political entity. It must be an economic entity. And this is the theme of this conference today. Unfortunately, there has really been no timeout instructing states that you either toe this path or you're out of it. And the call out, the timeout call out would have to come from the federal government. Give them a window, 10 years. Each of you go back, sit down with your team and formulate what you have comparative advantage over others and develop it. So it's nice to hear that Kebbi and Jigawa and a few other states are investing in rice and all that. There are states in the United States that depend only on potato. Right, so there's nothing. We need to have a system where states and the federal government thrive due to the prosperity of their people and not in spite of it. Because this rent-seeking economy that we run, and this not only affects the states, it also affects the federal government. The federal government, and you've heard the statistics by the vice president, is abnormally poor. I mean, only about 5 or 6% of our budget is reflected in our GDP, and it ought to be about 20-25%. So about a great number are not collected because we have not been able, as a nation state, to extract revenue through taxes or through the prosperity of the people themselves in creating wealth. Now, in seeking to rent from companies and the oil in extractive industries, it's really like watering a plant and the leaves and not the root. If the idea should be, and like has been earlier stated, the federal government is really a policy organ. The real action happens in the states and the local governments. To make that work, we must ensure that the prosperity of the people is our number one objective in governance. Each one of us must be a productive entity, able to not only fend for himself, but also contribute towards the national purse. Now, this is not happening. And this will not happen until the states are forced to make it happen. There's absolutely no state. In our time in governance, some of the northeastern states were in negotiation with Coca-Cola to provide gum arabic because there were sanctions on the Sudan, and Coca-Cola required gum arabic. Gum arabic is the additive that keeps the cola from separating from water in a Coke drink. And we had the landmass, we had the know-how to do it. But as long as the pressure was, once that was over and the pressure was not sustained, we let it go. A state like Benue, for instance, we import an amazing amount of fruit concentrate. Literally all the fruit drinks we have are based out of imported concentrates. Benue could easily provide all those concentrates. Benue, Plateau, indeed the north, what we call the middle belt. But the zeal, the desire is not there to do it. But there are other problems regarding this. You cannot grow an economy with a 30% interest rate regime. It's impossible. And therefore, the banking system is constricting the growth of this economy. I've mentioned that today we're not 196 million. In the next few years, in 2 years actually, we'll be 206 million. We should stop micromanaging exchange rates and focus on growth, ensuring that our people, right, can set up small and medium scale industries, but that is not sustainable at 30% interest rate regime. The only beneficiaries of it are the banks themselves. And therefore, in an economy that is in twists and turns as this one is, the banks are still declaring huge and horrendous profits. And you wonder, where is the activity taking place? Companies are constricting and reducing in size. Their tendencies are that people are on the streets, unemployed. The Federal Office of Statistics says that we have a 15% unemployment rate. I think it's the reverse. We have a 15% employment rate. 85% of the population is dependent on the 15% that are employed. And that's why you find that when you go to offices and you see people, they greet you, they overly greet you. It's a very sophisticated way of saying, please give me something, Now, I've talked about the round table. The federal government must cause and give the states 10 years. In 10 years, find your viability, because this is not going to work any longer. Nigeria requires an annual growth rate of 15% for at least 10 years to recalibrate its economic mechanism. That would take our economy to about a $2.5 trillion economy. A $2.5 trillion economy for a population that would be about 230 million at the time, 10 years thereafter, is what we require if we're not going to continue being a nuisance in the neighborhood. And to make this happen, there are certain easy ticket items that we can look into. Here we are. I talked about affordable credits, 15%, 30%. It doesn't make sense. And if you ask, they'll say, if you make it lower, it will lead to inflation. But I think the greater danger is unemployment. And if you take all the money in circulation and redistribute it such that people have something to do or some money to hold on to, you find that you actually have a deflated economy. You'll have to inflate the economy. So it's a very warped economics going on. The central bank recently, I think that was yesterday, the MPR, that they're going to maintain the exchange rate, the interest rate regime. In other words, there's not going to be any further growth in the country. I don't see how difficult it is for government or the central bank particularly not to appreciate that growth and affordable credits are intertwined. This is a nation that flares, or until recently, flared about 2.5 billion cubic feet of gas daily. 2.5 billion. That's equivalent to 25 million liters of diesel. If you had turbines to power all of Africa, they would not consume 25 million liters of diesel. But we do this. Now, what stops us? Since we cannot get electricity overnight to every nook and cranny of the country, what stops us from piping the gas to designated industrial zones throughout the country? To me, free. Because you were flaring it anyway. As our own subsidy, because doing business in Nigeria is a very, very difficult thing. So that is our own subsidy for doing it for business. Until recently, manufacturing accounted for about 8% of our GDP. It's actually down to about 4 or 5%. Manufacturing in a nation like this ought to be about 25%, because if it's only down to about 4%, in other words, we are keeping the factories in other countries working because we're constantly purchasing. And therefore, the premise of governance is to keep the exchange rate affordable. So if the exchange rate today should drop to 100 naira to $1, the country will celebrate it. But we are not looking at the more dangerous indices, which is how many people do we actually have working. No one is going to tell you that those folks who are hawking on the streets, selling potato chips and all sorts of things, that's not employment. If you look closely into their faces, you will see anger. And those are the people we should be worried about. Young people in the prime of their lives, trying to etch a living. We're looking straight into the face of danger here. Now, let me talk about a place I'm very familiar with, Cross River. When we assumed office in 1999, we did a SWOT analysis of our state. And we found out that with 23,000 square kilometers of land and barely 3 million people, with an ecosystem that extends from the mangrove to the temperate in the Budu, we could do a lot of agriculture. And we had mass expanse of land. I talked about a local government, Akankwa, in my state, that's the same size as Lagos. It has probably more plantations there than any other part of the country put together. Large expanse of oil palm growing there, pineapples. We also found that beyond agriculture, we could look into tourism. But tourism at that time was a very vague notion to a lot of people. Tourism for us was just getting feet to come to Cross River, because if you come to Cross River, at least you'll eat. And if you eat, someone will benefit from it, either the farmer or the restaurant or something. So the idea was to bring numbers to Cross River, because you see, Cross River is at the end of Nigeria. You don't go there. It's not like Benin that you're passing through, or Kaduna. If you don't have any business there, you don't go there. So we had to try to design a state that would attract people to come there. Now, the beauty of tourism is the people themselves generate the income, and the government taxes from them. In other words, the prosperity of the government depends on how well people are thriving. When I got in, our derivation as a state was 95,000 naira per annum. I know what I'm saying. I'm talking about 195,000 naira was what Cross River earned as derivation. So we used to wonder why it was cheaper to just wait until the amount will accumulate after several months than just buy a ticket from Calabar to Abuja to go collect it. We tried to wrestle with Akwa Ibom on this, because you see, Akwa Ibom at the time was getting about 5 billion naira. And we came up with this argument that the asset sharing formula between both states was 45-55, and therefore we should share the oil revenues 45-55. Victor Atta would not hear anything of it. In fact, that almost led to a fracas, a fisticuff, between himself and President Obasanjo, which ultimately led to the case being brought before the Supreme Court. That's where you heard the famous offshore-onshore derivation. And Akwa Ibom lost everything because all her oil is offshore. What they're enjoying today is a political solution. Unfortunately, Cross River did not enjoy that political solution when we lost Bakassi to Cameroon. And we lost the oil not to Cameroon but to Akwa Ibom State. That's an area that is, I think the jury is still out there, the fairness of that decision. We also tried to get oil, and the Vice President alluded to the states getting involved in the extractive industries, mining and all that. So we formed a partnership with a company called Petronas in Malaysia. And they carried us. We got a block. I don't want to name the block yet because I'm still hoping that one day we'll get that block back. But we got a block. They carried us 15%. The block had a reserve of about 1 billion barrels of oil. And so we looked 5 years down the line, we'll be very rich. Unfortunately, a certain general was added to the equation. And rather than wait for the next 5 years, he went to Petronas and demanded the money immediately. He wanted his money paid up front. And Prime Minister Mahathir at the time, he's back again, decided that the corruption in Nigeria and the demands for money is too much, so Petronas pulled out. Now, going forward, the two famous indices we've heard of Budukado Ranch and Tinapa. Let me explain Tinapa. Tinapa was really just to draw traffic to Cross River. Like I said, we're at the end of Nigeria, really at the end of West Africa. Tinapa was designed to attract about 3 million visitors annually. And this is not my statistics, this is KPMG. And we figured that if 3 million people came into the state and spent an average of 100,000 naira, either from purchases at Tinapa or restaurants or hotels, there's a 300 billion income coming into the state. And if we're able to attract 10%, with a multiplier effect, of course, if you have 300 billion, with a multiplier effect of at least five times, that's 1.5 trillion naira into the economy. And if we're able to attract just 10% of that, that's about 115 billion coming into the state coffers. We were working towards that. But the devil in all this is continuity. We had an arrangement with a company called Walmart. Walmart is one of the biggest corporations in the world, retail, and they do some wholesale. And we were able to attract them to Africa. They came, they purchased a company in South Africa called Massmat, the owners of Game, as their flagship on the continent. Massmart now got into negotiation with us, and we're going to take 2 emporiums. Their interest actually was not South Africa. It took them quite a while to even buy Massmart because there was a lot of resistance. They spent 2.8 billion in that enterprise. But their interest was in West and Central Africa, but particularly Nigeria. And they were not only interested in the sale of goods. No, their model is very, very simple. They encourage local manufacture. Local manufacture will only thrive where there are assured markets. And so Tinapa was going to be their hub between Angola and Senegal. Now, conservatively, we thought we'll get 3 million visitors. I think we would have gotten a lot more than that. The carnival alone attracts almost 1 million people that month of December into Cross River. If we were able to get Tinapa thriving the way we planned it to, I think we would have gotten a lot more than the 3 million we estimated. But it was our drive towards being a self-sustaining entity, economic entity. And for us, we were planning that by the year 2012, all our receipts from the Federation accounts will go into a savings account called the Futures account. That didn't happen for the devil I call continuity. Now, this is not unique. Most of the foods in this country come from the middle and the northern states. What need be done is how to tax or generate revenues from all that activity of feeding. That is something we've not looked into as we ought to. I'm getting my lines crossed now. Having said that, if we don't compel, it's okay to talk about restructuring and all that. And to me, there's nothing wrong with it. We ought to restructure. People restructure their lives on a daily basis. Corporations restructure. If you don't restructure, then you're stagnant. So as a nation and an economy grows, you restructure. But also, as the Vice President said, you ought not wait for that to happen before you do the restructuring. We need to make it happen. The problem in the entire political system as we run it today is the lack of the will to make things happen. We talk all the time, but do very little to make it happen. And until this changes, our nation will continue being imperiled as it is, and perhaps in another 30 years, we would be the biggest nuisance on the face of the earth. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you.